Imagine being eaten alive, not by wild animals, not by fire, but by thousands of writhing maggots that have made your living flesh their feeding ground. Imagine feeling them crawl under your skin, burrowing deeper every day, multiplying in the rotting caverns of your own body. Now imagine that this nightmare was your own fault, that your arrogance, your cruelty, your absolute refusal to bend to nature's will had created the perfect conditions for this living hell. This is the true story of Isabel Clara Eugenia, the Spanish empress who thought she could control water itself, and how that decision led to one of history's most horrifying deaths. A death so gruesome that even hardened medieval executioners would have called it excessive. Welcome to the darkest corner of royal history, where pride became pestilence, and power became a plague of living agony. The year is 1599. Madrid's Alcazar Palace bakes under the merciless Spanish sun. These stone walls have witnessed executions, torture sessions, and the screams of those who dared defy royal authority. But inside these chambers of power, something far more sinister was brewing. The Spanish Empire was built on blood. The Inquisition had perfected torture into an art form. Auto da fe ceremonies turned human burning into public spectacle. Heretics were broken on wheels, stretched on racks, and flayed alive in the name of God and King. Into this world of institutionalized brutality was born Isabel Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II, the king who had turned cruelty into statecraft. She learned her lessons well, too well, and she was about to discover that the universe has its own ways of balancing the scales of suffering. Because when you spend your life inflicting pain on others, sometimes that pain finds a way to come home, and when it does, it brings friends, thousands of them, with teeth. Isabel wasn't born evil, she was made evil, shaped by a court where mercy was weakness and compromise was treason. Her father, Philip II, had shown her the Inquisition's torture chambers when she was just 12 years old. "This is how we maintain God's order," he told her as they watched a heretic being stretched on the rack until his joints popped like breaking branches. Power that doesn't inspire terror is power that won't last. The lesson stuck. By age 33, Isabel had witnessed hundreds of executions, dozens of torture sessions, and countless public floggings. Death was her daily bread, suffering was her entertainment, and absolute control was her obsession. When she married Archduke Albert of Austria in 1599, it wasn't love that bound them, it was empire. The Spanish Netherlands would be her kingdom, millions of souls to rule with iron authority. And rule them she would, with all the medieval brutality her father had taught her. Brussels welcomed the newlyweds with pageantry fit for conquering heroes. But Isabel saw through the smiles to the rebellion beneath. The Dutch provinces were already in revolt. The Flemish were growing restless, and Isabel knew exactly how to handle rebellion. The same way the Spanish had always handled it, with pain, with fear, with methods so brutal that resistance would become unthinkable. She had no idea she was about to become the victim of her own philosophy. Water. Such a simple thing, the source of all life, the cleanser of all filth, the one substance that no human being can survive without. Isabel looked at the canals and rivers of the Netherlands and saw something different. She started leverage. It started with licenses, fees on waterways, taxes on mills. But Isabel's twisted genius went deeper. She understood that controlling water meant controlling everything: trade, hygiene, agriculture, even rebellion itself. Thirsty people don't revolt, they beg. By 1605, a drought had turned her water regulations into weapons of mass torture. Brewers couldn't brew. Farmers couldn't water crops. People couldn't even wash the filth from their bodies. And when they protested, Spanish soldiers crushed them with the same efficiency they'd used against Aztecs and Incas. Bodies piled in the streets of Ghent. Blood ran in the gutters of Antwerp. But Isabel wasn't satisfied with mere massacre. She wanted to break their spirit forever. June 10, 1606, the decree that would seal her fate. Water is a resource of the state. Its use, distribution, and trade are subject solely to the authority of the sovereigns. The people called it the water ban. History would call it her death warrant. Because when you declare war on the most fundamental force of nature, nature has ways of declaring war back. And it was already choosing its weapons, microscopic soldiers that would turn Isabel's own body into their battlefield. 1606. Isabel noticed a small rash on her arm. Nothing alarming, just a minor irritation that seemed to appear after a particularly stressful day of crushing another water rebellion. The royal physicians barely glanced at it before prescribing their standard cure, all mercury ointments. Mercury, the miracle cure that was actually liquid death. Every application poisoned her blood a little more, weakened her immune system, made her flesh more vulnerable to invasion. But Isabel trusted her doctors completely. After all, they were Spanish. They knew about suffering. The rash spread, small pustules erupted along her arms and neck. The itching became unbearable, a constant, gnawing irritation that made her scratch until she drew blood. Perfect little wounds, perfect entry points, perfect breeding grounds for what was coming. And something was coming. In the filth-caked corners of her unwashed chambers, in the stagnant air that hadn't been cleansed by water in months, microscopic predators were waiting. Flies breeding flies, looking for the perfect host for their offspring. Isabel kept scratching, kept applying mercury, kept avoiding water like it was poison itself. She was preparing her own body for colonization, creating the perfect environment for invasion. And the invaders, they were ready to accept her invitation. The first eggs were laid in October 1606. Invisible to the naked eye, nestled in the festering wounds she'd created with her own fingernails. In the medieval world, they called such infestations God's punishment for sin. Soon, Isabel would understand exactly what they meant. By spring 1607, Isabel was avoiding public appearances. She told her court it was merely fatigue from governing such rebellious subjects. But behind the closed doors of her chambers, her Spanish ladies, in waiting, were witnessing the birth of a nightmare. The pustules weren't healing. They were growing, swelling, and moving. Dona Sancha, her most faithful attendant, was the first to see them, white, writhing shapes beneath Isabel's skin, living things, feeding things, growing things. "Your Highness," she whispered in horror, "there's something alive in your wounds." Isabel looked down at her arms and saw them too. Hundreds of tiny white maggots, wreathing in the rotting flesh of her own body, eating her alive from the inside out. But this was just the reconnaissance force. The real invasion was yet to come. By summer, the maggots had grown bold. They weren't content to stay hidden in small wounds. They wanted territory, living territory. And Isabel's mercury-poisoned, water-starved body was perfect real estate. She could feel them moving under her skin, burrowing like tiny miners through the tunnels of her flesh, creating highways of corruption through her living body. The agony became madness. But still, she refused the one thing that could save her: water. Clean, flowing, life-giving water. The very thing she denied her subjects was the only thing that could cleanse the horror from her flesh. But Isabel's pride ran deeper than her pain. She would rather die than admit she was wrong. But not quickly, not mercifully. The maggots had other plans. They were just getting started. By autumn 1607, Isabel's body had become a living ecosystem of horror. The original maggots had pupated, emerged as flies, and laid new generations of eggs. Her wounds had become nurseries for an ever-expanding army of parasites. The infestation wasn't random. It followed the pathways of her circulatory system, her lymph nodes, her nervous system. The creatures were intelligent enough to avoid vital organs while maximizing her suffering. They wanted their host alive. They needed her alive. Because dead flesh stops growing, and they were still hungry. During a crucial meeting about the Dutch rebellion, Isabel erupted in a violent coughing fit. Archduke Albert watched in absolute horror as a fully grown, writhing maggot flew from her mouth and landed on the council table. His wife's body was so infested that the creatures were literally spilling out of her. The council members fled. Hardened Spanish generals who had witnessed the worst atrocities of conquest ran from the room like terrified children. Because what they'd seen wasn't natural. It wasn't human. It was something from the deepest circles of hell. That night, alone in her chambers, Isabel finally understood the full scope of her situation. She removed her bandages and saw her reflection in the mirror. Her once beautiful face was swollen and disfigured. Maggots crawled visibly beneath the skin of her cheeks. Her neck writhed with living corruption. She shattered the mirror with her fist, driving glass shards into her already infested wounds. But even this self-inflicted torture couldn't compare to what the maggots were doing. They had turned pain into an art form. They had made suffering into a science. And the ultimate irony, the woman who had made torture her policy, who had perfected cruelty into statecraft, was now the victim of a torture so exquisite that no human torturer could have devised it. Nature had out-brutalized the Spanish Empire itself. News of Isabel's condition couldn't be hidden forever. Whispers spread through Brussels like plague itself. The Empress is being eaten alive. God's judgment for the water ban. She's become food for worms. The rebels took it as a sign. Their resistance doubled in fury. Albert, desperate to save both his wife and his kingdom, secretly contacted Dr. Jan Baptist van Helmont, the most skilled physician in the Netherlands. Van Helmont took one look at Isabel's condition and delivered his verdict like a death sentence. Parasitic myiasis, he diagnosed, fly larva infestation. Advanced stage. The creatures have been feeding for months, possibly over a year. The mercury treatments have weakened her immune system to the point of collapse. And the lack of hygiene, he couldn't finish the sentence. The treatment would be medieval in its brutality. Each maggot had to be extracted individually with surgical forceps. The wounds had to be washed with boiling water mixed with vinegar. The pain would be indescribable. And there was no guarantee of success. Never, Isabel shrieked when presented with the treatment plan. I will not be bathed like some Flemish peasant. I will not be cleansed with the very substance I have banned. Her pride was literally eating her alive, and still she refused to bend. But the maggots were making the decision for her. They had grown so numerous, so bold that they were emerging from her body in broad daylight. Dozens of them would spill from her mouth when she spoke. Her ladies in waiting found them in her bed, on her clothes, crawling across the floor of her chambers. Isabel was no longer a human being. She had become a living incubator for creatures that existed only to consume flesh. And the worst part, she could feel every single one of them, every burrow, every moment of their feast upon her living body. April 1609. Isabel finally broke. The maggots had burrowed so deep that some had reached muscle tissue. Others had found their way into her sinuses, creating constant pressure behind her eyes. She could taste them. She could smell them. She could feel them converting her body into their nursery. If I must die, she whispered to Van Helmont, let it be clean. I have lived too long in my own filth. Too long as food for creatures that should fear me, not feast upon me. The bath was prepared with ceremony fit for a funeral. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme, herbs with antiseptic properties that might give her infected body one final chance at cleanliness. When they lowered her into the fragrant water, Isabel released a sound that wasn't quite scream, wasn't quite sob. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of maggots abandoned her body en masse. They poured from her wounds like white rice from a torn sack. The clear, herb-scented water turned crimson, then black with corruption. Van Helmont tried to count them, gave up at 300. They kept coming, streaming from wounds that seemed impossibly small to house such numbers. Isabel's body had become a factory of horror, and now the inventory was being revealed. For the first time in over 2 years, Isabel felt clean water against her skin. For the first time since the infestation began, the constant crawling sensation stopped. The relief was so overwhelming that she wept, not from pain, but from the memory of what it felt like to be human. That night, April 15, 1609, Isabel Clara Eugenia died quietly in her husband's arms. Her body, finally free from its parasitic tenants, looked peaceful for the first time in years. The woman who had banned water died clean. Isabel's death sent shockwaves through Europe. The official cause was listed as wasting sickness, but the truth spread like wildfire. The empress who had denied water to her subjects had been eaten alive by creatures that thrived in filth. Divine justice, people whispered. Poetic punishment. At her funeral, the Archbishop of Mechelen delivered a eulogy that would echo through history. The Empress Isabel teaches us that power, like water, must flow freely to give life. When we try to hoard it from fear or greed, it corrupts and corrupts its holder. As her coffin descended into the royal crypt, a gentle rain began to fall over Brussels. The people took it as a sign water finally freed, blessing the city with new life. The water ban was lifted immediately. The rivers flowed freely once again. Today, 4 centuries later, Brussels still remembers. Every June, on the anniversary of her death, the city holds a water festival. Children learn that clean water is a right won by those who came before. And the story of Isabel Clara Eugenia serves as a warning sign. When you wage war against nature, when you turn cruelty into policy, when you believe your power is absolute, remember the Empress of Worms. Remember that the universe has its own ways of balancing the scales. And sometimes, that balance is measured in blood, tears, and the writhing bodies of creatures that turn human flesh into their feeding ground. This is why we study the darkest chapters of history, not to celebrate them, but to learn from them. To understand that absolute power doesn't just corrupt absolutely, sometimes it devours absolutely. If you want more stories from history's torture chambers, more tales of how cruelty finds its way home, subscribe now. Because the past is full of horrors that deserve to be remembered. And trust me, Isabel's story is just the beginning. There are darker tales waiting, more brutal lessons to be learned, more ways that history teaches us the price of absolute power. Until next time, sleep well, and maybe appreciate your clean water a little more.